Hey guys, it's Kid Kino here. So way back when I set up my Patreon, I promised my first patron the rewards assigned to the highest tier, one of which was being able to assign me a topic for a video. That honor ended up going to Exploder Button, who asked me to do a video about Godzilla Raids Again, and while I didn't mean to leave it on the back burner for this long, it's now been a year and a half. So as I'm coming out of my August hiatus, I figured instead of just knocking out another kaiju binge video, I should finally make good on that promise. After all, the guy's still a patron after all this time I've kept him waiting. Exploder Button? This one's for you. Now I really didn't mean to put this video off this long, but I think part of why I did was I didn't really feel like I had that much to say about this movie, and I don't think I'm alone there. As far as I can tell, the fandom consensus on Godzilla Raids Again is that it's a mostly unremarkable, rushed sequel that's really only notable for maybe 3 things. 1. Introducing the monster versus monster premise, 2. Introducing the monster Anguillus, and 3. The truly special American recut, Gigantus the Fire Monster.
Banana oil.
And they're partially right, it was a rushed follow-up. So rushed, in fact, that they couldn't even wait for the director and romantic leads of Godzilla to become available for the sequel. Ishiro Honda, Akira Takarada, and Momoko Kochi were already on to other projects, one of which would be the abominable snowman adventure Half Human. And Raids Again was kind of inconsequential in the long run. Toho quickly moved on to myriad other unrelated monster and special effects films, and only brought Godzilla back 7 years later when presented with the opportunity to pit him against King Kong in the massive hit that led to the Godzilla series as we know it today. But listen, just because a film isn't that revered doesn't mean there's nothing to say about it, and I'd be a hypocrite if I caped as hard as I do for Godzilla's Revenge but wrote off Godzilla Raids Again just because I didn't like it as much. So I'm going to do my due diligence, take another look at this movie, and share whatever insights I can. So I've said this before, and others have said it before me, but Godzilla Raids Again has some similar war trauma elements to the first Godzilla. The main difference is that where Godzilla was largely preoccupied with the atom bomb and the subsequent nuclear arms race, Godzilla Raids Again recalls more of the civilian experience of the war. The eerie quiet in anticipation of an attack, blackouts meant to render cities invisible to the enemy, listening to the radio for updates and announcements on the situation as it developed, and the sight of cities burning in the distance. In particular, it seems to recall the ongoing fire bombings of Tokyo. There's such an emphasis on fire throughout the Osaka battle that it's easy to see why Warner Brothers arrived at the idea of
Gigantus
and
the Anguillus
as fire monsters. The characters are all employees of a cannery in Osaka, with pilots Tsukioka and Kobayashi scouting for schools of fish. They're ordinary people, and it shows, with the script relying on a few somewhat contrived incidents and connections to keep them involved with the larger story concerning Godzilla and Anguillus. One criticism I've heard of the story has to do with the portion after Godzilla and Anguilus' battle in Osaka. Much of the city has burned down or been severely damaged, and the company president sends Kobayashi to the company's Hokkaido branch, with Tsukioka and radio operator Hidemi, his girlfriend and the president's daughter, staying behind briefly to help the Osaka branch regroup before rejoining Kobayashi. What follows is a stretch of the film focused on the characters' personal lives. Kobayashi, spurred by a bit of banter about Godzilla delaying Tsukioka and Hidemi's wedding, begins to look for a wife in Hokkaido, while Tsukioka reunites with his former comrades and commanding officer from the war, now members of the Japan Self-Defense Force. This reunion allows Tsukioka to volunteer for the bombing raids against Godzilla at the end of the film, but Kobayashi's search for a bride does little to serve the overall story, other than underscoring the tragedy somewhat when he's shot down while trying to contain Godzilla on a small island. Basically, the complaint there is that this quick move to Hokkaido and this detour into character-focused drama lessens the impact of the destruction of Osaka. I don't entirely disagree, but I think it serves a purpose, or at least produces an effect that is consistent with other aspects of the film. While it does quickly shift the focus away from the kind of devastation that the original Godzilla lingered on for some time, it also allows for a more optimistic approach to its wartime illusions. This is a story about ordinary people who are faced with an all-consuming crisis entirely beyond their control, but who pick themselves up, rebuild, and carry on, even finding opportunity and happiness in the aftermath of nightmarish destruction. The original Godzilla centered around important individuals, people who had the ability to strongly influence the outcome of the crisis, whether through education and status, coincidence, or a combination of both. Godzilla Raids Again isn't about those people. Dr. Yamane shows up once, and we do see the generals overseeing the JSDF countermeasures, but the film is centered around people who, for the most part, can only take the crisis as it comes and do their best to carry on through it, as the Japanese have done for millennia with earthquakes, typhoons, and tsunamis. Even when they do participate in the search for Godzilla or the final attack on the island, they do so as the rank and file. The role of the JSDF in this film ties into this as well. David Callett mentions in his commentary on the original Godzilla that the scenes of the self-defense force evacuating civilians and defending Tokyo provided audiences with military imagery they had largely been starved of during the US occupation, and heroics which they could applaud without any of the guilt that might come with cheering for Japanese troops in World War II. In Godzilla Raids Again, Kobayashi explicitly mentions that Tsukioka and his old friends Tajima and Ikeda flew together during the war. They fight together again at the end of the film, trying to trap Godzilla on a small island. In keeping with the overall theme of recovery, it's easy to see this as another example of Japan's wartime development being put toward more constructive and less aggressive applications, a theme that would later inform works like Atragon and Space Battleship Yamato. More than a cathartic purge of nuclear trauma, Godzilla Raids Again offers a fantasy of independent recovery and reconstruction that Japan never really got to have, and a testament to the indomitable spirit of the real Japanese people. One other observation I want to make has to do with the film's director. Now, there's a certain tendency among Western critics and viewers and academics to focus on individual directors' filmographies when looking at Japanese cinema, which I think is maybe a bit fallacious. Japan's studio system was a lot like old Hollywood, vertically integrated with producers mainly running the show, taking the factory-like approach of turning out large numbers of films very quickly. This intensified with Toei's release of a new feature and a new serial installment every week, beginning in January 1954, leading the other studios to ramp up production to keep up, often releasing films on double or triple bills. The result is that there are just a lot of Japanese films from the mid-20th century, many of which were made to keep pace with the competition. I don't think the majority of people writing about Japanese cinema were any bigger hardliners about auteur theory than film people in general, which is really to say it's more of a widespread implicit bias than a deep personal conviction. But if you're going to try and examine a national cinema with such an insane volume, focusing on a handful of celebrated directors makes that a lot more manageable and is a shortcut to some really good shit. So you end up emphasizing directors more than did the industry in which they worked, though some undoubtedly enjoyed more autonomy and control than most, but that's how you end up with such an intense focus on your Akira Kurosawas, your Yasujiro Ozus, and that tendency is replicated within kaiju fandom in the cult of Ishiro Honda. I certainly don't mean to demean or undersell Honda's artistry or ability, but his incredibly revered status in kaiju fan circles can't help but seem slightly at odds with the quiet, unassuming man one reads about in Steve Reifel and Ed Godziszewski's biography. He's remembered as a visionary, an image often lent legitimacy by the mention of his tenure as an assistant director under Kurosawa, but I think, speaking very generally, we tend to forget that he was by nature a reserved and loyal artist working diligently on the projects given to him by the studio, Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka admitted to being the reason Honda came to be seen as a specialist in genre films. He gamely accepted the job of directing Godzilla when Toho's first choice of director passed on it, while Honda for his part gave his all to the sci-fi and monster films that followed without complaint. He always yearned to direct more films like the romantic and family dramas and war pictures of his earlier career. I say all this not to tear down Honda, but to point out that he didn't direct a career-defining 25 tokusatsu pictures just because he was an auteur with an overwhelming passion for that particular genre. My point is that a director's fortune and the direction of their career were very heavily influenced by the producer-driven studio system. Even before Godzilla, that system had been kind to Honda, offering him A-pictures like The Man Who Came to Port and war epics like Eagle of the Pacific and Farewell Rabaul. Motoyoshi Oda, the director of Godzilla Raids Again, had been far less fortunate. Oda had worked with both Honda and Kurosawa under director Kajiro Yamamoto, and graduated to directing early while Honda's career was stalled by his conscription into the Imperial Japanese Army. However, he wasn't given the kind of projects on which Honda would cut his teeth as a director leading up to Godzilla, let alone films that would allow him to develop a singular artistic voice and win him prestige like Kurosawa's. Instead, Oda would mainly be a reliable director of unglamorous programmers, the cinematic chaff discarded by the auteurist approach to Japanese cinema, serving mainly to keep Toho's high volume of output to theaters consistent. His best-known film prior to Godzilla Raids Again was the previous year's The Invisible Avenger, one of a number of films by Japan's major studios combining an invisible or mutated man with crime stories, this one featuring a small amount of effects work by Eiji Tsuburaya. So when Toho needed to get a quick sequel into theaters to capitalize on Godzilla's success, they turned to Oda. While for reasons I've just explained at length it would be hasty to assume Oda had extensive input into the screenplay, one of the screenwriters of The Invisible Avenger collaborated with two of Godzilla's writers on Godzilla Raids Again, so it is possible that the film's status as straightforward product, assigned to a director of program filler, influenced the writing. It certainly seems that way from the film's focus on the more lightweight personal tribulations of its more working-class characters, and its emphasis on action over direct social commentary. Regardless, I find it interesting and fitting, given the careers of their respective directors, that while the original Godzilla centers on the dilemmas of upstanding people thrust unexpectedly and sometimes reluctantly into positions of pivotal importance, Godzilla Raids Again is a simple, tumultuous, but ultimately optimistic fanfare for the common man. I want to thank everyone for watching and bearing with me through my recent hiatus, and especially Exploder Button once again for becoming my first patron and for requesting this video. It got me thinking about this film more than I normally do, and I've developed a bit more of an appreciation for it than I might have otherwise. Thanks as well to John Paneer, Ryan Clark, and the rest of my patrons for supporting me through this hiatus as well. I'll have the next Kaiju Binge video up publicly soon after this, but at least for the first week or two, this one's just for you guys. See you again soon.